How much smarter are modern peoples compared to ancient persons? It is difficult to gauge how much smarter people have become. Certainly, mankind has become more civilized. Our technical competence is something to be proud of. A look at economics might help to gauge the difference between modern persons and ancient man. In the old days, a physical object would be worked on, meaning value would be added to it. Mental activity culminated or resulted in a modification of some real object. Arrowheads would be improved, new styles of swords were developed, jewelry was invented from metals and gems. If the artisan wished and other artisans had a similar desire, items with added value would be made available at a market. A market is where a buyer and a seller meet. There may be many hundreds of buyers and sellers, but the market exists for the sole purpose of bringing one buyer and one seller together. The buyer and seller are two people. The buyer is a person that wants what the seller has. But this is a false and limited understanding. To permit a buyer and a seller to exist, each must manifest the other identity to their opposite. The buyer is only a buyer to the seller. This may seem obvious, but it means that this is not how he sees himself. The buyer is a seller in his mind as the seller is a buyer in his mind. The buyer of coal is a seller of what he wishes to part with. The exchange between buyer and seller is an equilibrium of value. Each sees equal values being exchanged, but in his or her own mind, or in terms of his or her accounts, the buyer and seller have prospered. The buyer spends $10 to obtain a $10 item. The seller wants the $10 more than what he or she sells. The buyer wants the product or service more than the $10. All progress is created because of one person creating value and adding this to a real-world object who is able to meet someone who has done the same, but with a different physical thing. Two people who added value to the real world come to an agreement, the buyer and the seller, to exchange the things with their added value. The value of the product or service is what the buyer and seller decide it is. This is the elemental unit of civilization. The obligation incurred by the buyer might be transferable over time, or to a third party, or not, in order to make the exchange possible. If not, barter was used to effect the exchange. If the obligation was transportable and transferable, various means were used to turn the value into information that could be communicated over time and distance, and to a third party. We call this method of conveying information about value money. But all there is in the market is added value and a means to convey the information about the value to a third party. That is all the market is and was. People understood value as something added onto assets to make the article useful to man. Useful is a measure of value. But the determination of value was always personal. Buying and selling and the determination of value was never a community matter. Now, with the superior brains of modern man and the prevalence of experts in the modern community, the community has gotten involved, en masse. The value of what we buy and sell is now dictated by the community to buyer and seller. This dictation of value is called the formation of a social agenda. Politicians tell us what our values ought to be, and they tell us what ends we ought to strive for. Modern people think there is a reason why we do things. They think they know the reason. They think politicians or experts know what the reason is and tell us why we want what we want and why we ought to do what they say we ought to do. There is no reason. There are only preferences. There are your preferences, and there are the preferences of others. The question is whose preferences are paid for by whom? Modern people have left the artificial environment of the market. The outcome of leaving what is artificial is to return to what is natural. What is natural is the natural world. Moderns now live like animals, according to natural law. Moderns have adopted the dual hypothesis of nature. There is a natural law that governs all animal life. Natural law is the law of the jungle. Natural law is the law of survival. Natural law states that the fittest for survival live, the rest die. The law of nature decrees that might makes right and the end justifies the means. Those who disagree end up dead. Get enough people willing to kill others for not complying with your reasons for doing what you are doing, your preferences in other words, and you have established a custom, and you haven't established a social agenda, and you have helped create the modern world. There is no reason for what people are doing, there is only the fact they can do it because they have the will and the power to do it, and because, so far no one has had the power to stop them.